All right. So who do we have online? I can see there's some people. Oh, Tam is online. If you can hear me, raise your hand in the GoToWebinar hand raising thing. You know how to do that? There we go. Wonderful. We're going to start in a couple of minutes. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So if you've been following in this series, there was another class essentially on how to get everything set up, how to connect MLS, RPR, zip forms and all that. If you have not did not have a chance to participate in that and you would like to get a copy of that video or to watch it or that sort of thing, a recording, send $5. Send me an email and I can send you a link to that recording. So at this point, I've assumed that you're able to log in to zip forms, that you know how to import if you're going to write an offer, how to create a template and how to apply the template. And now we're going to talk about the actual forms themselves. So this is going to be a series. There's going to be several of these. We're actually going to eventually get into counteroffers and contingencies and notices to perform and all that wonderful stuff. The beginning of the package is disclosure regarding agency relationship. This is a relatively simple thing. When you scroll down to the bottom, the point here is you want to make sure that it's checked. If you're representing the buyer, that you put a check mark for the buyer or a check mark for the seller. If you've done it right, it should import their names, it should import your names, all that sort of stuff should be on the form. There's not a lot to say. This is the back of the agency disclosure form, which is required by the Civil Code. It's basically what the Civil Code says. I tell people it's good if you have insomnia. Possible representation of more than one buyer or seller. This is simply saying that there may be, and the broker, that means you and or anybody from your brokerage may be representing other buyers at the same time. There's nothing you can do about that. And there might even be dual agency if the property that you're writing an offer on is one listed by your brokerage. Moving on down, we have offers are not necessarily confidential. That's a paragraph many people do not realize is there. I've actually had agents submit confidentiality agreements and things like that. But notice it says buyer is advised that seller or listing agent may disclose the existence, terms, or condition of buyer's offers unless all parties and their agent have signed a written confidentiality agreement. Right? I'm not sure you knew that was there, but that is if you are dealing with a high-end property and you want to make sure your offer is confidential, you could include a confidentiality agreement with it. Before. Then we get to the wire fraud and electronic funds transfer. These are a lot of what might be considered common sense things. They will be, don't wire their deposit money to people they're not sure of. Now we get to the form, right? And this is just a sample. Let's see which one. That's one's already filled out. I'll work with this. So this is one that I had put together as an example from a property in Morgan Hill. It was a cheap fixer-upper for $7 million, a very nice looking property actually. And so when we are filling the form out, we start with the date prepared, and it should import the name of the buyer and the property and all that. Here, while we are doing this, why don't we just go back and forth. And you'd put in the price. As we're going through this, the date that it's prepared is not necessarily the date that the buyer signs. It's not necessarily the date the seller signs, certainly. It's simply the date that you prepared the form. You could prepare the form today and date it today and then have it signed tomorrow. All of that would work. Buyer would go in there, description of the property, the amount, close of escrow. There, typically you'll see agents type in 30 days or 21 days or a certain number of days after acceptance. That oftentimes works just fine. However, sometimes those days fall on a Friday or a Saturday or a Sunday or a holiday, which makes it more difficult and would require sometimes an addendum. So it might be better to actually pick a date. That's roughly the number of days you think. I'm just saying. Then there's disclosure of agency, confirmation of agency. What's different about this is that they've a little while ago revised the forms. They're asking, does in this example Intero represent both the buyer and the seller? And so you would check the box that says the seller. Or if it's being an in-house sale, you would check both the buyer and the seller. And then they're asking, does the salesperson represent the buyer and or just the seller? And so they want you to answer the question both for the brokerage as well as the salesperson. We put in our information, your office, the buyer only, or both if it's one of your office listings. And then you also would answer the question, are you personally the representing just the buyer or both the buyer and the seller in the transaction? That's what all of that is about. We now come to well, this is the right one. It's got blue and so when we get to the initial deposit, one of the things that I've highlighted for you, and we're going to go through it, is every time the contract says that the buyer shall do something, right? One of the things that would be useful for you is to go through the purchase contract looking for the words buyer shall, seller shall, and this is a contingency, right? That sort of a thing, because you probably would like to have a list at all the things the buyer shall do. And the first buyer shall is to deliver a deposit directly to escrow holder by electronic funds. That's what it says. Unless you have a really good reason, I wouldn't be checking these other boxes. Reality is, as long as the money makes it into escrow in time, there's no harm, no foul. It says within 3 business days. That's the default setting. You might want to check if this is a competitive offer situation, right? And how you write a contract might vary depending on whether or not it's multiple offers or you're the only one that's writing an offer. If this is a competitive offer situation, sometimes the listing agent will ask for it, and sometimes the selling agent, the buyer's agent, will offer to put the deposit in the next business day, rather than within 3 business days, to put it in the next business day. And the reason why that makes your offer a little bit stronger is it signals to the listing agent that you're not making offers most likely on 2 or 3 properties, because the way you can get away with that is just not putting the money in till the last minute that you have to. So, and sometimes the listing agent is going to say in the instructions they want that you're going to put the deposit in by the next business day. So electronic funds is the default. You could just leave it at that. The amount of the deposit, it is customary, it seems today, that the deposit is 3% of the purchase price. That's not a rule or a law or anything like that. The reason 3% is the typical deposit amount is because that's the maximum amount that a seller can keep if the buyer defaults on a residential 1 to 4 property. So because 3% is the most that can be kept as liquidated damages, it has sort of become customary to put in 3%. It wasn't that long ago that, especially when you're making offers with a lot of contingencies, and let's say the seller doesn't have any inspections and any reports or any of that stuff, it's not uncommon to put down a deposit of only 1%. Because there's still all of these contingencies that are out there, and the buyer doesn't want their money tied up. And then we would do what's called an increased deposit. And the increased deposit would be, I highlighted that really well. It's the second buyer shall, and that's if you have an increased deposit. So you could have 1% in paragraph A and another 2%, and either within a certain number of days, or you can simply write in when the contingencies have been removed. If it's an all cash offer, when I've highlighted it in, this was a reddish color, what this is a segment of the purchase contract that relates to contingencies, one or another. And if you check the box all cash offer, you're saying that this offer is not contingent on the buyer obtaining a loan. If you do have a loan contingency and you're filling out the form, you should fill out under first loan what the interest rate is and points if you want that to be part of the contingency. So if you want to say the seller's only going to, the buyer's only going to buy the property if they can get a $600,000 conventional loan, 30-year fix for no less than, I don't know, 3.5, I don't know, something low, something ridiculous. And if you don't write that in, then you're not making the interest rate part of the contingency. If interest rates go up, it's arguable that your buyer would have to accept any loan they could qualify for, regardless of the interest rate amount. If there's a second loan, I'm writing an offer hopefully today again, or soon, which is an 80-10-10. So there's an 80% first, there's a 10% second. You'd be filling it out there, and then they would have 10% down. If it's FHA or VA, it means you're probably not in San Jose, Saratoga, or Los Gatos, but there's a special amendatory form. We're not going to get into that in this class. So if you've been filling out the right-hand columns correctly, the computer should calculate how much you need. Page 2 of the residential purchase agreement begins with the verification of down payment and closing costs. And notice this is a blue. Blue are where buyers have to do something. The buyer shall within 3 days after acceptance deliver verification of the buyer's down payment. And you should be, if you're doing this right, checking this box that says verification, checking the box that says verification is attached. Right? You should be doing that, because this is what the agents are referring to in the comment section of the listing when they say proof of funds, or sometimes POF. I've had many new agents text me and say, what does POF stand for in the listing? And it means proof of funds. It could be copies of bank statements. It could be stock statements, things like that. Then I is a big contingency, the appraisal contingency. If you are buying the property with an appraisal contingency, I tell clients that they don't have to worry too much about overpaying for the property. And that's because we have appraisal as a contingency. And the lender, who's got more money in the deal than you do, is going to send an expert out to look at the property and come up with an estimated value. It either will or will not match. If it doesn't make it up to the sales price, then you don't have to buy the house. You could get your money back. You could renegotiate. If you check the box that this is not contingent upon the written appraisal, then that means somebody's going to have to make up the difference if it doesn't appraise. So if the purchase price is $1 million, it appraises for $950. If that box is not checked, it means you can negotiate with the seller about that difference. If that box is checked, it means the buyer is obligated to come up with the $50,000 in addition to their down payment. And then it says remove the appraisal contingency within so many days. Usually we put in something like 12 here or something like that. You don't really need 17. One thing to look out for, let's say you're writing an offer and the listing agent has given you a stack of disclosures, inspections, and reports. And in that stack is a relatively recent copy of an appraisal. And that appraisal says that the property is worth $1 million. And you write an offer and it's contingent upon the property appraising, right? You didn't check the box, not contingent. Your lender appraiser, the appraiser that the appraisal management company selected for your render, appraises the property and it comes in at $950. Now, let me just, may have made that more complicated, but the offer is for $1 million. The seller already has an appraisal that says $1 million. The lender has an appraiser go look at the property and they say $975, $950. The question is, have you met the appraisal contingency? Has it been met? And the answer is yes. If you read the wording here, it says this agreement is contingent upon a written appraisal of the property by a licensed or certified appraiser at no less than the purchase price. Notice it doesn't say that that appraisal has to be done by the appraiser selected by the lender in this transaction. It does not say that. So if the listing agent has given you a copy of an appraisal, you should know that if you want appraisal still to be a contingency, because your lender is going to send an appraiser out and the loan is going to be based upon that, then you would need to write that into the contract, because right now that other appraisal is going to meet that contingency. Loan applications, you should be checking the box at the end of that paragraph that says you have a letter attached. You should have already had your client go and talk to the lender and find out what they can qualify for. Loan contingency is in red. This is another big contingency. It says the buyer has to act diligently and in good faith, and the buyer's qualifications for the loan specified above is a contingency of this agreement. If there's no appraisal contingency or the appraisal contingency has been waived or removed, then failure of the property to appraise at the purchase price does not entitle the buyer to exercise the cancellation right pursuant to their loan. So what this is saying is, if that it's the price is $1 million, it appraises for 950. If you have the $50,000 and can otherwise swing it and buy the property with that loan, then the fact that it didn't appraise doesn't mean that that the loan contingency hasn't been met. Those are two separate things. You'd have to prove that it would have to be that you could not qualify for the loan that was mentioned in that other paragraph. Loan contingency removal, 21 days is a long time. A lender was telling me yesterday they can close in 14. Others have said 21 they could close. I would usually put in 10 or 12 days. If you've done this right, it would be better if not only have you gotten somebody pre-qualified, but pre-approved, and that it's actually been submitted to underwriting and has been, beginning that process. Loan contingency removal, I think I said that already, that it doesn't have to be 21 days. Buyer shall remove the loan contingency or cancel this agreement after that time period. It's both a shall and a contingency. No loan contingency, you would check that box if you're confident that loan is not going to be an issue. So, for example, if the lender has already submitted the package to underwriting and the underwriter has, blessed it and all that, then it may be wise, if you're in a multiple offer situation, to remove the loan contingency. So you're signaling to the seller and the listing agent that even though your buyer is getting a loan, it's pretty much all wrapped up and it's not contingent. By the way, if there's no loan contingency, then you don't really need to fill out interest rate and all that stuff on that other paragraph. You don't really need to, because there's no loan contingency. Lender limits on buyer's credit. This is something that comes up often. And I had an agent that I was helping, and the agent was giving the buyer a credit, and the seller was giving the buyer a credit, and like everybody was giving the buyer a credit, and the amount of the credit exceeded by $5,000 the buyer's closing costs. And what this is saying about lender limits on buyer's credit is that if the lender limits, so let's say it says in the purchase contract, seller to credit buyer $15,000 towards closing costs. You write that in. But in reality, there's only $12,000 of closing costs. There's only $10,000 of closing costs. Now, the buyer probably is expecting that difference, that it was $15,000 credit, but they only have $10,000 in closing costs. The buyer is probably expecting that other $5,000 they can play with some other way, use it as a down payment, reduce the sales price. That's not what this says. It says if the total credit allowed by buyer's lender is less than the contractual credit, then the contractual credit shall be reduced to the lender's allowable credit. And in the absence of a written agreement between the parties, there shall be no automatic adjustment to the purchase price to make up for the difference. You just need to know that there's a limit, right? Some lenders don't want the credit to be used for down payment, right? They only up to a certain amount. Buyer stated financing. Um, Now, what this paragraph says is the buyer is supposed to get the loan that the buyer wrote about on page 1 and to do so in good faith. However, there's sort of a hidden context in this paragraph. Notice the part that I've highlighted. It says buyer shall pursue the financing specified in this agreement. All right. Seller has no obligation to cooperate with buyer's efforts to obtain any financing other than that specified in the agreement. And the availability of such alternate financing does not excuse buyer from the obligation to purchase the property and close escrow as specified in this agreement. Now, my reading of that last part of the paragraph is that your buyer could do something different from what it says on page 1 of the purchase contract, as long as they close on time and they don't need the seller to cooperate in any special way. If they had a 80% loan on the contract, but end up doing a 90% loan, for example, that's not necessarily pursuing what it said in the agreement. But if they can close on time, people don't care. Well, they might care, but basically, as long as you close on time, the seller is not obligated to do anything special to help you. I've seen cases where the offer was written as all cash, the buyer showed they had the cash, and then they were getting a loan anyhow, as long as you can close on time. Sale of the buyer's property is in red. It should be a bright red, in that this is a big contingency. And this is where the buyer's ability, where the agreement is contingent upon the buyer selling their house. This agreement and the buyer's ability to obtain financing is not contingent upon the sale of property owned by buyer. That's the default setting. If you check B, it will launch another form, the COP form, and that's the contingency of property form, which says that the agreement and buyer's ability to obtain financing is contingent upon the sale of property owned by the buyer. When you click on that form, that's a form we'll go through later. It wants to know, is the property listed already? Is it in escrow? We can talk more about that, but I've done several transactions in the last year where there was a contingency to sell the property. Again, how long has the home been on the market? If the answer is 4 days and they were all over each other at the open house, then this may not go. If the answer is it's been there for 90 days and there are crickets on the weekend when they occasionally do an open house, they might be willing to wait and see if your buyer can sell their home too. This is other things you could check. We're not going to go through all of these in this class. Other terms, this is where you get to write poetry. You can write a little poem and about what other things you might want. Things that typically would go in here. Let's say there's a credit being given by the buyer's agent to the buyer. You could write that in. Let's say the buyer is a relative of the buyer's agent. You could write that in. My general rule of thumb for agents is don't write in stuff unless you have a really good reason, right? Just because there's a place to write in stuff doesn't mean you necessarily have to do that. Allocation of costs, inspections, reports, and certificates. Note it says it does not, unless otherwise agreed in writing, this paragraph only determines who is to pay for the inspection, test, or report. It does not determine who's going to pay for the work. Now, if the listing agent has already given you a natural hazard disclosure and includes the environmental, then you don't need to mark any boxes, right? But let's say there is no NHD report and you want one, and you want the seller to pay for it, then you could type that in. You could put in other reports. Usually, in a typical situation, we're not filling in anything in 7A. 7B, typically you check the seller is going to pay for smoke alarm, carbon monoxide device installation, water heating, bracing if required by law, which it probably is. And prior to close of escrow, seller shall, looks like I may have even missed a shall, seller shall provide buyer written statements of compliance, right? That's a seller shall do that. Paragraph 7B2, typically I don't check any of these. It sometimes messes up the lender if you do. Sellers don't like it if you say the seller. And when it's talking about compliance with other minimum mandatory government inspections and reports, or compliance with other minimum government retrofit standards, those are primarily talking about issues in Southern California. If you knew that the county where you were writing the offer had that, you could check, like let's say the county requires a minimum amount of insulation when property is being sold. That's what happens in some Southern California areas. Who's going to pay to bring up the insulation? Now, I would typically not check anything here, because the seller's not going to like it if you tell the seller, and the lender's not going to like it if they see these boxes. But if you have an inspection contingency, right, then and you then discover that there is a mandatory minimum government retrofit program that's going to affect that property, we could roll that into the inspection contingency, right, and then ask for the seller to do it later. Escrow and title, I have to admit that I use Chicago Title Transfer Tax, there it is, .com, Chicago Title Transfer Tax.com. The title companies all have these things, but this is just a really nice one, because if you're writing an offer and it's not in Santa Clara County, it's in Alameda County, who pays for what? Right? It's in Union City. Is there a city transfer tax in Union City? Right? People will ask me, is there a city transfer tax in Union City? And I'll say, I don't know. But if you go to the Chicago Title Transfer Tax.com, you'll see nothing in Union City. So this gives you a easy to find. Title companies also give you printed copies of it, but it would tell you who's going to pay for what. That's customary. This can be negotiated, but at this point, I wanted to just talk about how to fill out the form in a normal situation. But yeah, there's nothing this isn't a law. Escrow holder shall be. If you know, and one way you might know is because the listing agent gave you a prelim, who the escrow holder is. If you don't know, I just oftentimes write in seller's choice, right? Because if the seller's paying, let the seller choose. And title, if the seller's paying, well, why not let them choose, right? There's an argument to be made that whichever side pays chooses. If this is a multiple offer situation, I wouldn't suggest messing with the title company the listing agent has chosen, right? If they've already chosen one. There's a county transfer tax everywhere, right? And typically the seller pays it. Whether or not there is or isn't a city transfer tax, you'd need to look at ChicagoTitleTransferTax.com. Many times we're writing in split 50-50. When it says that they split it 50-50, all this, of course, is done in zip forms. If there's a homeowner association, typically the seller would pay for the transfer fees and the document preparation fees. The box, seller shall pay for a private transfer fee. Don't know of too many of those around here, but there were times when subdivisions put in something that one of them involved, I think, the Sierra Club, where the subdivision, in order to get the Sierra Club from hassling the subdivider, agreed that every time there was a title transfer in the subdivision, the Sierra Club would get money. And so that was a private transfer fee. Is there one? It usually is mentioned on the prelim, but normally I'm not checking that box. Again, if you have contingencies like a title contingency, which includes a prelim, and inspection contingencies, you could work that out later, but usually around here we don't have those things. Home warranty, who's going to, or anyone, is anyone going to pay for it? If I'm the listing agent, I would tend to already have a home warranty on the property with what's called seller's coverage. And I would be explaining to my seller why it's in their best interest to give the buyer one, so that the seller doesn't have to go to small claims courts, right, afterwards. If that's not the package and you want the seller, you could check the box and you could, put in not to exceed, $500. You should look at the different ones, what other things are being covered. Sometimes if the buyer's agent is planning on getting a home warranty for the buyer, just as part of what they do as a closing cost, you can check the box that says the buyer waives it. Now, that doesn't mean you can't buy them one if you're the buyer's agent. It just means we're not putting this in the contract. And my suggestion about home warranties is that if you're buying a buyer a home warranty, buy the upgraded platinum, whatever they've got version, the titanium upgraded platinum version. The worst thing that can happen is something breaks. The buyer says, "Oh, Mike got us a home warranty. We'll call them." And then it's explained to them that Mike got them the cheap home warranty, the thrifty, basic, stripped down policy, and that what broke was not covered by the one I bought them. That's not what I would like the message to be, right? So if you're going to buy one for the buyer, buy them a good one. That's my suggestion. If the buyer is, and by the way, even if I'm asking the seller to pay for the home warranty, unless they already have one already, I'm going to write in buyer's choice for who gets to pick it. And the reason you, right, as the buyer's agent want to pick it is that whoever orders the home warranty is often the agent that is mentioned in marketing materials that are sent to that homeowner. So one of the reasons I like my sellers to already have a home warranty and include the home warranty is because it's a home warranty I ordered, which means that the buyer is going to get mailers and things from the home warranty company with my name on it but not the agent that represented the buyer when they bought it. Right. The best plan is if you're buying the home warranty, you order it and you order the good home warranty. 8 items included in the sale. Paragraph A basically says that the MLS and the flyers mean nothing. Right. Although I did write a snippy email to a listing agent today, and I quoted what they said in the MLS. But that says that what items listed as included or excluded in the MLS flyers or marketing materials are not included in the purchase price unless they're actually mentioned here. In other words, the contract overrides what the MLS says, what their flyers say, what it says on their single property website. Items included in this sale, all existing fixtures and fittings that are attached to the property. And then there's a really long list. Now, over the years, I've become more wary. And the rule here is if there is anything that looks even marginal, write it down and put it in the contract. Now, this might look like it's everything: existing electrical, mechanical, lighting, plumbing, heating, ceiling fans, fireplace insert, gas logs, grates, solar power systems, built-in appliances. Look at that list. Now, I sold a house. In the backyard in the garden was a green cement bench. In the garden, there was a bench, green cement. Is that included or excluded from the sale, given what it says here in paragraph 8B2? And the answer is it doesn't say anything in 8B2 about furniture in the garden. It talks about in-ground landscaping, but it doesn't talk about garden furniture, right? It doesn't say, oh, by the way, I ended up buying the buyer a bench for the garden, you know. And if you, I have this belief that if you park yourself outside of Home Depot and Lowe's, and you watched for people in business casual dress leaving with things like patio furniture and fireplace screens and fireplace inserts and chandeliers, and you asked them what they did for a living, real estate agent would come up more higher than our percentage of the general population, right? Because there was something that's not clear that was on this list that the seller took and the buyer wanted. I sold a townhouse where there was this candelabra, you know, driftwood kind of candelabra. It held candles. It was bolted to the wall, right? Had candles. I was the listing agent. The buyer moves in. The seller took the candles, right, that were bolted to the wall, and they complained, saying you stole. You know, that belongs to the buyers want it. I said to the other agent, this is a decoration. You know, if this had been a Monet painting that they had bolted to the wall because they didn't want it to fall down and be stolen easily, would you have expected to get that? The agent thought about it and then tried to argue that candles in a decorative piece were a lighting fixture, right? And I was like, good luck with that. But you understand, if there's something that's even a gray area, write it down, right? Put it down here, because this is what determines what you're going to get, assuming everybody follows it. Leased or liened items. There's a seller shall. The seller shall disclose to buyer, essentially, if so you're writing an offer and the house has solar panels. Isn't that wonderful? Happy days, right? The buyer's going to save all this money because, you know, they got solar panels. Now, the question is, does the seller own the solar panels? Is the seller leasing the solar panels? Are the solar panels subject to a lien, like a PACE loan or something like that? So let's say they're leased. If they're owned by the seller, there aren't as many problems. If they're leased, what this says is that the seller has to give the buyer a copy of that lease. And by the way, even though a leased item is personal property, right, because the solar panels belong to somebody else, they're being leased, many times the solar panel company will record that lease as a fixture and it shows up on the prelim, which means you're going to have to deal with the fact that the solar panels are leased. So they give you, the buyer, a copy of the lease for the buyer to read. And what I have found that oftentimes happen is the buyer will do research on that solar panel company and find out that a lot of people are not happy with them, and that they'll decide that they don't want the solar panels. Now, the last one I did had an $8,000 penalty if the lease is not continued. Who's going to pay that? You understand? So the issue is there a lease? Another related issue is, will the buyer qualify for the lease? And you might be saying, my buyer is qualifying for a $1.5 million house. Certainly they can lease solar panels. That's not always true. And that's because the solar panels are depreciating quickly in value, whereas the house, not so much. And I've had cases where people could qualify for a loan to buy a house, but didn't qualify for the solar panel lease. It says buyer's ability to assume any such lease or willingness to accept the property subject to any such lien or encumbrance is a contingency. And this is unusual for the residential purchase agreement, because it says it is a contingency in favor of buyer and seller. You do not see that phrase anyplace else. Right. Now, what that means is, if the buyer doesn't want to take over the lease, the seller can cancel the contract too. Either the buyer or the seller could cancel the contract if you do not work out what's going to happen to the solar panels and their lease. If it's got a PACE loan, it's got other problems, right? So I'm just saying, the last house, not the last house I wrote an offer on, but the one before that, you could see that they had removed the solar panels from the roof. You could see what was left over. The issue and why buyers don't want to take it over is that the solar power technology is getting better and better every year, and prices are dropping, and many people do not want to own 10-year-old solar panels or even 5-year-old solar panels. This is an issue if they're solar panels. Then seller represents all items are included, items excluded from the sale. There's a interesting paragraph here about brackets. Right, fascinating paragraph, and basically it's talking about the televisions on the wall, monitors, and things like that. It says that brackets attached to the walls, floors, or ceilings for any such component, furniture, or item shall remain with the property or be removed, and holes or other damage shall be repaired but not painted. Right? Do you want the brackets left in the wall? Now, frankly, I've noticed that most people don't pay any attention to the paragraph and they take the brackets off the wall, and I don't know. But if you want the brackets to remain, that's what the contract says. Or if you want them gone, you check that box there. Closing and possession. Does the buyer intend to live in the property or not? Right. If they say does not intend, then that changes the loan criteria. Seller occupied or vacant property, possession shall be delivered at 6 p.m. I know people that change it to noon, 4 p.m. I usually don't mess with that. On the day of close of escrow, it could be no later than so many calendar days after close of escrow. If the seller is saying, I need the money in order to move my stuff out and I'll be out the next day, give me the money, I'll move the next day, I'll be gone the day after that, you could write that in, which brings about the paragraph C concept of the seller remaining in possession. And if there's the SIP form, the SIP form, if the seller is going to remain in possession and you check that box, that form gets loaded. The SIP form is going to get loaded into your package. And that brings up interesting questions like who's going to pay for insurance during the seller in possession, who's going to pay for utilities, is there going to be a security deposit that's going to be held back in escrow? That whole idea is a class in and of itself. Tenant occupied property, does the buyer want the tenant there or not? If I'm in fact recently was talking to somebody who has a seller with a tenant in the property, and this is a single family house. The likelihood is that the buyer does not want the tenant in the property. My suggestion to sellers is get rid of the tenant before you put it on the market. Get the tenant out, give them notice, get them out, clean the place, paint it, get it staged, do what you need to do. Leaving the tenant in could cost a lot more than the amount of rent they're paying you. Because I asked this agent, does the tenant want to move? No. Are they happy that they're selling the house? No. So if you have to go through the tenant in order to make an appointment to show the house probably is not going to be clean. They're probably not going to be cooperative. What happens if you represent the seller and the tenant doesn't leave? Right? You say we're closing next week and the tenant says, well, yeah, but we're not really ready. We're going to need a few more weeks. Our other place isn't going to be ready. What are you going to do? Start with a notice to pay or quit? Evict them, right? Yeah, it's much better to get the tenant out. If the tenant is in the property, you as the buyer's agent just want to monitor this to make sure the tenant is leaving. Sometimes your client wants the tenant there because it's got rent, and then you would check this box that says the tenant to remain in possession, the TIP form, which means you want the tenant, right? Because they're going to continue to rent it. Seller shall provide keys, passwords, codes. That's another seller shall. Mailboxes, security alarms, home automation systems. Statutory and other disclosures. Seller shall deliver to buyer, and then it starts off with a really long list potentially of things, if required by law, a fully completed federal lead-based paint disclosure form, FLD, and pamphlet. I talk about this in my contingency class. Did you know that the buyer has 10 days under the law to conduct a lead-based paint inspection and decide if they want to buy the house or not, and that supersedes whatever contingency removal you put into a purchase agreement. I'm just saying, if the property was built before 1978, I'm actually meeting now lead-based paint inspectors, which I haven't as often over the years. So you have to do what else? It says here the statutory disclosures, real estate transfer disclosure, NHD, natural hazard, notice of actual knowledge of release of illegal substances, special tax assessments, mellow roofs, on it goes. And they want, SPQ. Any statutory, this is an important paragraph, any statutory disclosure required by this paragraph is considered fully completed if seller has answered all questions. So I'm working with an agent where we made an offer without any contingencies, but the seller didn't have a termite inspection. And now we have one. Escrow is not closed, and we're asking the seller to give us money. And the first thing I always do is I look at the SPQ to see if the seller answered all the questions. And amazingly, I often find the answer sometimes is no, they didn't answer all the questions. So if the seller hasn't answered all the questions, then the seller has not fulfilled the disclosure duty under this purchase contract. And I've had this done to me where the other agent says, answer the question. And then when the seller answers those questions, it triggers the possibility of a 3-day right of rescission. However, the buyer still has to act in good faith. We're going to talk more about that in the contingency class. So I had one where the seller had missed a couple of answers. The buyer had wanted out of the transaction because they didn't think the lot size, the guy was an engineer and he measured the lot himself and he didn't think it was as big as it said it was, and so they wanted out. The buyer's agent is demanding that the seller answer these 2 questions. We answered the questions in the SPQ, no was the answer, and then the agent said, okay, we're canceling under the 3-day right of rescission. And I said, that's not going to work because it says any kind of a cancellation or use of a contingency has to be done in good faith. And since our answering the questions provided no new information to the buyer, in fact, provided information that there wasn't anything wrong, that it isn't in good faith to attempt to trigger a cancellation. But you should know that this isn't done until everything's been answered, right? Every question. And so they have to give you all of that stuff. Note to buyer and seller, waiver of statutory and lead disclosures is prohibited by law. Right? You get certain things regardless of what the contract says. Paragraph 4, seller shall complete and provide buyer and with a seller property questionnaire. Seller shall provide them with an exempt seller disclosure if they are in fact exempt. Buyer shall return signed copies, right? This is your to-do list, I guess. 6, in the event of seller or seller's brokerage firm prior to close of escrow becomes aware of adverse conditions materially affecting the property or any material inaccuracy in disclosures, information, or representative previously provided to buyer, seller shall promptly provide a subsequent or amended disclosure or notice in writing covering those items. If the seller or the listing office before escrow closes discovers something that they had not disclosed, they are required to amend the disclosures that they've made, the TDS, and that triggers another 3-day right of rescission. However, as it goes on, if that information was discovered by the buyer and the buyer's inspections, then the seller does not have to amend their transfer disclosure or seller property questionnaire. And then that, therefore, not triggering the 3-day right of rescission. We're going to spend more time talking about contingencies in another one. Buyers shall have the right to cancel this agreement within 3 days. That's referring to what happens if they change it. Natural environmental hazards disclosures and other booklets. If you watched my first class where I talk about templates, one of the things that I cover is if you're representing the buyer, you should go into Zip Forms. You should go over where it says add documents. You should select in the drop down, add another library where it says CAR library. There's a little arrow, drop down arrow. And on that drop down list is something called EPUBs. And in that 1 through 6 is copies of the lead-based paint, the earthquake, and all of those little booklets that you're supposed to give to the buyer, and a page for the buyer to sign a receipt. What I see that is, I think, disturbing, at least to me, is that I see agents that are representing buyers, and because the seller has a receipt for these booklets and the seller disclosures, the buyer is signing the receipt that they've been given all these booklets, but in fact, the buyer has not been given any of those booklets because the buyer's agent never bothered, right? I don't know, they just didn't do it. So what you need to do if you represent the buyer is give them a copy of all these booklets, right? And so what I've done is downloaded them and put them into a Google Drive folder so I can share all of the booklets with them and have them sign a receipt saying, yes, I've got them, I'm signing the receipt. Don't just sign the receipt that the listing agent is giving you without actually giving them all these booklets. It's just a thought. Withholding taxes. Seller shall deliver to buyer FERPTA, California withholding law, an affidavit of non-foreign status. Sometimes you see these, sometimes not. I always let the title company do it because they can, and they're going to do it anyhow. I've Megan's law, database disclosure is required by the contract. It would be something your client might want to look at, and there are other sources, right? So if somebody wanted to find out what the crime rate was in a particular neighborhood, there are lots of ways to do it. There's crimereports.com. You'll find there's hundreds of sites that report all this stuff. And this is saying that this particular one, the Megan's Law, which is the sex offender database, is right here. You can go look at it. But during the inspection period, this would be something the buyer could also look into if they wanted to. Gas, liquid transmission pipelines, there's a link there. You're going to find reference to all this stuff in most of the natural hazard disclosure statements. If there's a homeowner association, if it's a PUD, a planned unit development or a planned development project or a condominium project, the seller hopefully has already given you a copy of all those disclosures. The CC&Rs, the bylaws, the homeowner association meeting minutes, and all that fun stuff. Notice it says buyer's approval of CI disclosures, that's common interest disclosures, is a contingency of this agreement. Does your buyer ever plan on renting this property to somebody else? Right? That would be a question. If they say, well, yeah, we might do that. We've been thinking about doing Airbnb. We've been thinking about maybe using this as a rental after a while, right? Because they checked the box they were going to move into it. That's on another paragraph, but they're maybe not going to move into it. And they're going to rent it out. Many homeowner associations have rental rules, because if too many of the units are rented out, then lenders don't want to deal with it. And so they sometimes cap how many of the units can be rented at any particular time. right? So it might be that there's actually a waiting list. In other words, if the buyer cares about that, you or the buyer should be looking at the bylaws and the rules of the homeowner association regarding rentals. Does the homeowner association have any money? You and or your buyer ought to read the meeting minutes of the homeowner association and their newsletters and are their upcoming assessments, what's going on. This isn't something to just completely ignore and stick in a file and not, pay any attention to. They oftentimes have limitations on what kind of at-home businesses the person can have, right? A lot of times it says you can't have hardly any of them. So you want to make sure that you've gone through this, that those issues that might come up with the homeowner association that you and or your client have looked. I would draw like a little line to the side of some of the things in the HOA documents and have my buyer initial next to it. I had a buyer, I was writing an offer on a townhouse up in Almaden, up in the wilds of Almaden, and I'm reading the meeting minutes of the homeowner association because sometimes that's where some really juicy stuff is, and they start arguing about wild pigs, right? They're discussing the wild pig problem and what to do with the wild pigs, and I read the next meeting minutes, and again they're talking about wild pigs. The next one, again they're talking about wild pigs. The next one, they formed a wild pig committee in the homeowner association to investigate the wild pig problem. They eventually hire a professional pig trapper. This is a career path I didn't even know was possible. But anyhow, and the guy caught like more than a dozen pigs the first weekend he was trapping. I marked this in the HOA document so that my client, who had a teenage son, could see that, you could actually see pig droppings here and there. And I told her that if she goes ahead and buys the property, I would buy her son a crossbow and get him a big barbecue spit, which you're not actually allowed to do either of those things. But you get the idea. If there's something in there that might cause your buyer not to want to buy the house, they ought to see it and think about it. And when you get older and more careful, you might want them to initial next to something that says they got it, they read it, they understand it, they're buying it anyhow. So that brings up to paragraph 11, the condition of the property. We're going to take a break because it's been an hour. And so, I'm paid by the hour and the hour is up. So next week, we're going to start with the condition of the property. We're going to go through the rest of the contract. You can see all sorts of fun, good things are going to be coming up. If you have any questions about other kinds of training we have, I have a coaching program for people and other ways in which you might want to be able to increase your real estate business. Reach out to me. I'd love to talk to you about how to do that. All right, guys, was that fun? Are you happy?